and welcome to Slate Money, your guide to the business and finance news of the week. I'm Emily Peck, and I'm here with Elizabeth Spires of the New York Times and Slate. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello.
And in for Felix Salmon is the wonderful Anna Szymanski of Reuters. Hey, Anna.
Hello, hello.
So today on the show, there is an election coming up. We're going to talk about that. But first, we're going to talk about the drama at the Washington Post, which lost 250,000 subscribers this week after the paper's owner, some CEO kind of guy, I don't know, rich guy, decided the paper wouldn't run a presidential endorsement. We're going to talk, yes, about the election, what a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency might mean for the economy. We are going to look at companies maybe cracking down on people for abusing their perks and benefits, especially in big tech. And if you're a Slate Plus subscriber, there is even a special bonus episode for you all about a New York Times article that is quite sympathetic on the parents of jailed and disgraced crypto executives from FTX. That's all coming up on Slate Money. If you love iPhone, you'll love Apple Card. It comes with the privacy and security you expect from Apple. Plus, you can earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, which can automatically earn interest when you open a high-yield savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app, subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Apple Card and Savings by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com.
This episode is brought to you by Global X. Since 2008, Global X ETFs has been committed to empowering investors with unexplored, intelligent solutions. Global X specializes in exchange-traded funds that offer exposure to the artificial intelligence ecosystem, including themes like data centers, robotics, semiconductors, and cloud computing. To learn more about Global X's entire suite of ETFs, from covered calls, fixed income, emerging markets, and more, visit globalxetfs.com.
Okay, so this week, the Washington Post decided it wouldn't run its endorsement of, surprise, surprise, Kamala Harris. And we learned the reason why it was pulling its endorsement was because Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, big billionaire type, didn't want them to run it. He ran an editorial explaining why. People didn't like the editorial explaining why. He insisted in it. This wasn't about quid pro quo. He wasn't doing this because he was worried about Trump or the kind of retribution a second Trump term could rain down on any one of his companies. He was doing it because endorsements don't matter anymore. And that's just the truth. That's what he said. No one seemed to truck with this argument. And what instead happened is people got very upset, really kind of surprisingly really upset. The Los Angeles Times the week before, their billionaire owner also said they weren't going to do an endorsement. People got moderately upset, but because of who Bezos is, I think, and because of what the Washington Post is and how in 2016 they changed their slogan to "Democracy Dies in Darkness" and got a Trump bump because people were expecting them to be kind of like the paper of record for the resistance or something. This is like a really big turn for them. Bezos is huge. They lost more than 250,000 subscribers as we're taping, just like a huge 10% chunk of their subscribers. It's a really big bite out of their business.
Yeah, if you ever wanted to use the word decimate correctly because you're a language pedant, this is the appropriate place to use it. It's their subscriber base was literally decimated.
So Elizabeth, I see a lot of people arguing this is no way to respond because it's hurting the journalists at the Washington Post. This boycott is bad for that reason. I mean, what do you make of that argument?
It's important to understand, why the boycott is happening. I don't think it's because people believe that newspapers should make newspaper endorsements. It's the last minute interference from a billionaire owner. And secondly, the kind of people who actually subscribe to newspapers are high information people. They're not like normal news consumers, and they are much more engaged in these issues. And thirdly, the Washington Post specifically is in DC. It's sort of the paper for covering politics, and particularly electoral politics. So it has a very different impact than the LA Times or even the New York Times. So I don't think the reaction isn't totally surprising in the sense that if this kind of reaction were going to happen anywhere, the Washington Post would be exactly where it would happen. And I just don't think it really has to do with whether people think endorsements are important, which I would agree at in presidential level, they probably aren't, but we do see effects in down ballot elections that make them important.
Do you think the boycott itself was effective, Anna?
I mean, we won't know whether or not it's effective for a while, but I would say in terms of impacting Jeff Bezos in any way, absolutely not. Like, he makes all his money from AWS. This is a vanity project for him. Now, whether maybe it hurt his pride slightly, okay, fine. But in terms of who it would impact more, I mean, to be perfectly honest, it probably would impact actual journalists more than it's going to impact Jeff Bezos.
But I guess one argument would be that the boycott, though it might not impact Jeff Bezos or maybe even change anything at the Post, it at least is drawing attention to an issue that might not, like, if not for the boycott, we would not be talking about it at all. So is the boycott sort of like an effective form of collective action on the part of subscribers?
Yeah, I think it is, but that's because boycotts they're not just designed to damage a target economically. In this case, you have somebody like Bezos who does care about appearances and probably, only wrote the editorial defending his decision after there was a big backlash. But, even more importantly for the Post internally, after this decision was made, half the opinion columnists wrote columns, criticizing the decision. And it made the sort of news side people who were covering Bezos, I think, double down on their Bezos coverage. So there's sort of unanticipated consequences like that, or unanticipated for Bezos, I think. A lot of people who are newspaper owners don't understand what motivates journalists or why this would be, a big morale problem internally. And I think that makes it more difficult for people at the newspaper to do their job. So the boycott wasn't just about giving Bezos a hit financially, which I agree with Anna. It has no effect on that whatsoever. It's about agenda setting and really, pulling the issue to the forefront.
Yeah, and it certainly could change Bezos's actions moving forward, just in the sense that he might try to make sure that either don't interfere with anything editorially, or if he's going to do something and there could be the appearance of interference, like try to make sure that there is not the appearance of interference. I mean, I don't know whether or not this was a quid pro quo or just a mistake. Who knows? But it was a mess up regardless. It was bad governance regardless, because you should have thought through how this could look.
It's very triggering for people who are already, as we talked about last week, worried about the billionaires and business interests and, the potential presidency of Donald Trump, who, he enacts revenge against his enemies and he favors his friends. So it's a totally pragmatic decision. We don't know Bezos's reasoning. Like, it sounds like we're skeptical of his explanation that he just doesn't like endorsements. It's pragmatic though. If I'm a CEO or a business leader, and I'm looking at a potential Trump presidency, I have government contracts to think about at my many businesses. It makes sense that you would pull the endorsement. It doesn't actually make business sense. Am I wrong to be like the defender of democracy in this instance?
I do think this raises the interesting question of, in this increasingly partisan era, and especially, unfortunately, potentially in another Donald Trump presidency, how dangerous it is to be a business owner who owns a newspaper. Because regardless of this, endorsement, the Post is a very liberal newspaper. And most news outlets have political sides, whether it's conservative or liberal. And if you're also a business owner, and as you said, you do also have all of these potential government contracts, it does raise the question of, does this make sense?
I think it makes sense not to endorse in that case. But, if you're looking at, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, the potential outcomes of a Trump presidency versus a Harris presidency, the consensus with most economists is that Harris would be better for business. And I think that cuts against people's perceptions about partisan, which party's better on the economy.
That is a weird contradiction. Yeah. Well, better for business would make sense, because if Donald Trump is going to be picking winners and losers based on who says nice things about him, that means he is in fact worse for business. And then Anna's arguing, and definitely worse for anyone with a journalism or newspaper or media business.
Here's where I'll be sympathetic to people who own media companies, especially if they're, in the middle of these big issues. You have to have a tough skin to do that, because what happens is if your company is doing it well, everybody else with any kind of power will call you and lobby you and try to bully you into better coverage. And if you're going to be a media company owner, you really have to just say, I'm going to be totally hands off. And then you can turn to those people and say, sorry, it's just my editorial team. I don't interfere. And I think that's the best policy, because then you can be consistent about it.
And Bezos has just made that 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times harder. He can't say that. He can't say, well, I just let them do their thing. I don't interfere, since you just wrote a post explaining how he interfered at the last minute to pull the endorsement. It was actually really not a smart move at all by that reasoning. Do you guys think boycotts are an effective form of collective action and protest in terms of making a statement, drawing attention to an issue, instead of going out into the streets to the Washington Post headquarters, with picket signs or something, or with signs, a boycott might be a really effective thing to do?
I would say that boycotts only have worked historically when they've drawn more attention to an issue, and that has created other actions outside of just the boycott.
I'd agree with that.
Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. On the other hand, I am the publisher of the Inquirer. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates.
This episode is brought to you by GiveWell. You like to optimize things. You've chosen the perfect credit card to maximize your travel points, and you always find the fastest route when you drive. Shouldn't you handle your charitable giving the same way? GiveWell spends 50,000 hours every year doing deep dives into different charitable programs to help you do the most good for your dollar. GiveWell has now spent over 17 years researching charitable organizations and only directs funding to a few of the highest impact opportunities they've found. Over 100,000 donors have used GiveWell to donate more than $2 billion. Rigorous evidence suggests that these donations will save over 200,000 lives and improve the lives of millions more. GiveWell wants as many donors as possible to make informed choices about high-impact giving. All of their research and recommendations is available on their site for free, and you can make tax-deductible donations to their recommended funds or charities, and GiveWell doesn't take a cut. Give to GiveWell.org to find out more or make a donation. Select podcast and enter Slate Money at checkout to make sure they know you heard about them from us. Again, that's GiveWell.org to donate or find out more. When you think about businesses growing their sales beyond forecasts, you think about a product with demand, a focused brand, influence-driven marketing. But the often overlooked secret is the businesses behind the business making selling simple. For millions, that business is Shopify. Nobody does selling better than Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret? Shopify with Shop Pay can boost conversions by up to 50%. Meaning way fewer carts going abandoned and more sales. So if you're growing your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business today. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/money. Go to shopify.com/money to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/money. Now, as we have teased effectively, we will turn to just a small little issue, just a small minor thing. What would a Donald Trump presidency or a Harris presidency mean for the economy? So as far as I could tell, when it comes to Trump, I think that the big thing is for Harris, it's sort of like more of the same. I don't see her policies as all that different from what we're currently living with. So you would think it's more status quo. The economy is in relatively good shape right now. Not much to see there. With Trump, he's proposing a lot of big changes. I think he has said he would be amenable to getting rid of income taxes altogether in favor of tariffs. Regardless, he wants to do big time tariffs. He wants to extend his tax cuts. He wants to crack down on immigration. It's questionable as to whether or not he will truck with Federal Reserve independence. And he's also, in his first term and still now, is challenging economic data. And I would be nervous about a return and him messing with, the data that we rely on to even understand the economy. So, Anna, what are your thoughts here? What do you think a Trump presidency could mean, practically speaking? I mean, he's not going to be able to do everything. I don't think he could abolish the income tax. What would it practically, what are the warning signs? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the vast, vast, vast majority of economists, they will say that almost all of these policies would be quite negative. Obviously, things like reducing immigration and tariffs could be quite inflationary. You also have the potential for a trade war, because if Trump were actually to put on these types of tariffs, it's not like other countries aren't going to respond. They're going to respond. We're at a point in the economy where, yes, things are going relatively well despite today's lousy jobs report, although that was kind of a weird jobs report. Still, inflation still isn't actually where we need it to be. We still need it to come down a little bit. The Fed is just starting to reduce rates. And now you have the potential for this just enormous, tornado to come in and potentially really disrupt things. And I think, and then on top of that, you have the quite significant concerns about what this will do to both the deficit and the debt, which have expanded massively under both. I mean, frankly, since 2009, they've expanded massively, but expanded quite a bit, obviously, since the pandemic. And there's pretty wide agreement that Trump's policies would be far worse for the deficit, especially if his tariffs don't create the type of economic growth that he somehow thinks they're going to. Now, granted, I think a lot of economists are also somewhat concerned about what any party would do, because it doesn't seem like any party is really interested in fiscal responsibility. But I think there's far more concern with Trump. And frankly, you can see that in terms of what we've in the markets. Investors seem to be voting by having bond yields go up. Now, it's a large market. There are many things driving that. However, it seems fairly clear that part of it is concern that the more likely it is that we're going to get a Trump presidency, the more likely it is that we're going to have a less fiscally responsible government.
Yeah. Also, there's a kind of misperception that Republicans are more fiscally responsible on that front. But Trump had the highest debt and deficit of any president in modern history. But, that's also been true of other Republican presidents. They've had higher debts and deficits than Democratic presidents in recent history. And I'm constantly sort of trying to triangulate on why voters still think that Republicans are better on the economy generally. And I heard a theory yesterday that it sort of intuitively makes sense to me, which is that voters do understand on some level that Republicans represent the interest of the wealthy. And so they assume by virtue of that Republicans are smarter because they're richer, or the perception is that they're richer. And that does explain Trump a little bit.
I think also voters and people, I think like this a little bit. Voters don't think of tax cuts as an expense. They think of spending as an expense, which intuitively makes sense. But tax cuts wind up costing a lot of money and increasing deficits. But I think regular people don't see it that way. They just see it like money back in my pocket, whereas they see government spending as something that needs to be cut, they want Elon Musk now to come in. Sorry, I mentioned him this time. There should be like a bell that rings to come in and like cut expenses, government expenses. So I think that's like a difference in the perception.
They don't realize that tax cuts are stimulus. They think that if they're getting a check, that's materially different in terms of government spending than a tax cut, because they don't quite understand how the mechanics of how we do that.
Well, yeah, a tax cut feels like you're getting your money back, and a check feels like something else.
For the most part, and I would actually say Trump is a bit of an anomaly on this, but for the most part, the Conservative Party has historically been the party of smaller government, less interference in the economy, fewer regulations, lower taxation, whereas Democrats have traditionally been the party of bigger government. And so while one can certainly look at stock market charts and say, well, the stock market actually is kind of doesn't really care whether there's a Democrat or Republican. And if you actually look at what actually happens to the deficit, it's a little tricky to say whether what happens with Republicans, what happens with Democrats. But it is true that the parties do have these identities. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable that people would say that most conservative candidates, if people believe that a smaller government is better for the economy, that they would support the conservative candidate. Now, the thing with Trump, and I think this is why you have even a lot of traditional conservatives not necessarily in his camp, is because what he's asking for is a tremendous amount of government interference in the economy. I mean, yes, he wants to cut taxes, but it's the types of things, I mean, really essentially trying to pick winners and losers. Like that is about the most interference you can have.
Yeah. And so the other thing I would say is this notion that higher deficits are bad used to be a big thing in American politics and culture. And that's really gone away, I think. Now both sides, they don't really talk about attacking deficits the way they used to. It's just not an issue, especially with Trump. Trump really has been the one to sort of minimize that as an issue for politics and politicians. When you look at estimates of what either Harris or Trump would do to the deficit. Yeah, Trump is slightly worse, but Harris is no, budget hawk or anything. They'd both spend a lot.
Trump's a lot worse, though. Trump's like, it's not marginal. And I think part of I think you are correct that there's Trump has made it a non-issue, but partly because, first of all, it's so easy for Trump to make anything else an issue. But also, his campaign stays away from it. His supporters stay away from it now that they can't weaponize it against Democrats, the ones who understand what the debt and deficit actually are now. And so it's easier for them to sort of talk about things that are right in front of the face of voters. We've talked about this before, but when I talk to Trump supporters in my family, their number one issue is inflation, but they conflate inflation with cost of living. And they talk about gas prices a lot. And so it's easier for Trump to kind of make an economic rationale that all of that is the fault of the Biden administration. Partly because people just don't understand these systemic effects. They don't understand what tariffs would do to inflation or what mass deportation would do.
One thing I think is really interesting, like Trump, his policies are so conflicting. Like he wants to, I guess, cut taxes theoretically to stimulate the economy. He also wants to do this mass deportation, which would get rid of millions of people. Terrible for those people, but from an economic perspective, terrible for the job market. So you're stimulating the economy at the same time you're shrinking the labor force. That's how you get inflation. That's how we got inflation or partly why we got inflation after the pandemic. We had very low immigration, during COVID, but we stimulated the economy and we had labor shortages. We saw wages go up quite a bit, especially for low-wage workers. Those two policies are very conflicting and I think going to be problematic. And I don't see, from business owners' perspective, his immigration policies are going to be terrible. And I could see maybe some tension and conflict there happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting when you talk to people in business who do support Trump. Often what you hear is, this is just a negotiating tactic. He's not actually going to do these things. And to me, that response doesn't entirely jive with history, because for most normal candidates, I would say that's true. Because most times on the campaign trail, you say whatever to get elected, and then you do something completely different once you're actually in office. But during Trump's first administration, he did quite a bit of what he said he was going to do, almost everything he was enabled to do. I think that's why there's become quite a bit of concern now that we might not only get a Trump presidency, but potentially this red wave. And then, that would mean that Trump would have a lot more of a hand in order to really push through some of these more extreme measures.
Yeah. Another factor is, related to that, I don't think we'll have a red wave even if he gets elected. But, if he doesn't have complete control of Congress, there are ways in which Congress can mitigate anything that he does want to do. But one area where I'm not sure that they can is the ways in which he wants to interfere with economic data. That's something that he can sort of do unilaterally. And, he did it with the census. If he started doing it with the BLS or, other organizations or agencies that we rely on to actually understand how the economy is performing, I'm not sure there's a lot that people could do to stop him. And then we really are up shit's creek because we won't fully have a picture of what's happening.
The one thing I've often felt, maybe to just make myself feel better, is that Donald Trump loves polls. And he seems to view the stock market as a poll of him when he's in office. So there's a part of me that feels like if things really just start to blow up because of some of his policies, that maybe could make him pull back. Now, it could also make him be like, oh, the stock market's been taken over by the witch hunt. But it could also make him pull back.
It's Biden's fault. So.
Exactly.
It's interesting right now. So you kind of mentioned this already, but one reason markets and economists don't like these really big deficits is because what they do to the cost of borrowing and to bond yields. And Anna, you should step in at any point where I overstep my explanation of bond yields. But right now, long-term, the yield on long-term bonds, 10-year treasuries, is higher maybe than some people would expect. Partly, and that means the cost of borrowing is higher, not just for treasury bonds, but for things like mortgages. That's partly because people are, or bond investors anyway, are worried about the chaos that a Trump presidency would bring, the chaos and the deficits and that a Trump presidency would bring. And we're already seeing in the UK and in France, we're seeing bond yields go up there too. And it sounds really nerdy and wonky, but if the cost of borrowing US bonds goes up, it makes the business of running a government harder. And that's like the big worry about deficits, that down the line, it makes the cost of running the government higher and it makes it harder. And, and that's where the trouble comes in. So the bond market is pricing this in, this worry over Trump chaos, but the stock market really isn't. And I don't maybe understand exactly why. Anna, maybe you could parse that out for me.
And one thing I would just point out is that we are already at a point where we are spending over $1 trillion to service our debt. We're spending more to service our debt than we're spending on defense. That's significant. And if bond yields stay elevated and the debt stays elevated or increases, that problem just gets worse and worse. And also, just quickly to say, globally, what's happening in the US is definitely also impacting what's happening with bond yields globally, although you also have other issues there, obviously. You had the budget that was released in the UK this week that has been responded to negatively because there's going to be more borrowing. You also have issues in France, with concerns there. So there are lots of things going on here. But when it comes to the stock market, and when you say the stock market, what you really probably mean is the S&P 500. And still so much of that is being driven by a small number of companies that are continuing to do, for the most part, pretty darn well. And there's being supported by AI euphoria. There's lots of different things. There's actual earnings there. Now, yes, in theory, if we were to see bond yields stay elevated or actually to increase, or if people thought, oh, actually the Fed is just not going to be able to cut nearly as much as we thought it was, that actually should trickle into the equity market just because the discount rate is increasing. But right now, part of the issue is just the stock market really is a small handful of companies. It's not the entire economy. It is a small handful of companies.
So it's not the best gauge. I mean, Trump might see it as the best gauge or poll on his performance, but it's really not at the moment very connected at all and wouldn't be.
Well, also, markets are just not economic indicators. And the reason why Trump loves the Dow as an indicator is that he's not that sophisticated about actual economic indicators. And he knows that the average voter knows what the Dow is. They know what the stock market is. They may not understand, GDP or productivity ratios. It makes the economic story more intelligible to people because it's something that they're more familiar with.
I want to spend at least 90 more seconds because we have mostly talked about Trump and said how terrible he would be for the economy. That's kind of my summary. Some business leaders do say that Harris would not be good for the economy. This is an argument. People don't like the antitrust crackdown from the Biden administration. They don't like more regulation. There's banking rules. There's all kinds of things that businesses really are not happy with at all. The business community are not big fans of the administration. So there could be some negatives there too, maybe, Anna?
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to in the business community. But yeah, I think obviously if Harris were to be elected, and frankly, she would really probably need support in both the House and the Senate to actually push through things like increasing corporate tax rates or, going after corporations on other ways. And frankly, I don't think most people think that would happen even if she were elected, just because it's unlikely you're going to have a blue wave. But look, yeah, I mean, I think it's reasonable to think that the idea of putting on tremendous more regulations, the idea of increasing taxes significantly, and you have had Harris engage in some kind of populist rhetoric around like, oh, I'm going to, try to control grocery prices. I mean, she's not actually going to try to control grocery prices, but that type of language doesn't engender a lot of confidence in people in the business world. I mean, I think what a lot of people in the business world would want is honestly a Harris presidency with a Republican Congress, because then Harris isn't going to do anything crazy, but you're not actually going to get any tax changes or anything because nothing's going to happen.
I guess the big thing we'll be we don't know what's going to happen on Tuesday, but we do know that the Trump tax cuts expire next year, and Congress does, in fact, have to do something on taxes. And that's going to just be, I think, no matter who wins, it's going to be a wild free-for-all of people just scrambling to pass whatever kind of policy they want to get done, because it's probably one of the few opportunities, assuming that we get divided government, one of the few opportunities to get anything done at all. So that's something I'm keeping an eye on.
One of the things I also think is interesting, and it's another way where Trump is quite an anomaly in terms of a conservative candidate, is that when it comes to antitrust, like Vance, who he picked as his VP, is actually very supportive of the antitrust policy that we currently have, or being even tougher. Like this, again, is not your traditional conservative ticket.
Yeah, Vance is a con head. That's the nickname for supporters of Lena Khan.
Yeah, it's sort of strange to watch because Trump is not a traditional candidate. He and Vance don't agree on everything, but he seems, unaware of what some of Vance's policies are, and so he gets blindsided by them in interviews, and he will either sort of deny that Vance has the position he has, or it has to be explained to him because he didn't sort of ask Vance about these things before he appointed him as the running mate.
This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy. Just drop in some details about yourself and see if you're eligible to save money when you bundle your home and auto policies. The process only takes minutes, and it could mean hundreds more in your pocket. Visit progressive.com after this episode to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states. If you love iPhone, you'll love Apple Card. It comes with the privacy and security you expect from Apple. Plus, you earn up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase, which can automatically earn interest when you open a high-yield savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app, subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Apple Card and Savings by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com. What I really want to talk about now is one of the most important news stories of our time. I'm kidding. What I really want to talk about now is Grubgate. This is what happened at Meta a few weeks ago. I think it was Anna's number. 2 weeks ago, Meta fired 24 workers because they had taken advantage of the company's perk, their meal perk. They give Uber Eats credits or GrubHub credits it's like $70 a day actually for 3 meals. And so Meta workers were using Uber Eats or whatever not to get their meals, but to order stuff from the CVS, to get wine glasses, medicine, have dinner sent home to where that's not the point. You're supposed to eat the food in the office. That's why they give you the money for the food. Then it turns out there's more perks crackdowns happening inside companies. EY fired workers because they were watching 2 training videos at the same time. And I guess that's not allowed, although I think it's incredible multitasking. And now Business Insider and I think the Wall Street Journal both have pieces on kind of like, is this the end of the big tech perks? These workers have gotten all kinds of like posh benefits, laundry money, meal money, vacations, gym, whatever. Are people cracking down? But first, before I want to talk about people cracking down, I want to ask Elizabeth, is it okay to use your Uber Eats meal credit to buy shit at the CVS or wine glasses? Like, maybe this is fine. Should these workers have even been fired?
I think it should be okay. I mean, these things are sort of packed into compensation packages. Whenever people are trying to do recruiting, they're like, oh, and you get this meal benefit. I don't really see as a cash outlay for the company. It's the same amount of money either way. And if it's making workers' life okay or better, why not? What I think people are using it for, though, is, or companies are using it to fire people they want to fire anyway and not position it as a layoff. Maybe not in all cases, but I think there is a cynical deployment of that sometimes. One of the perks that somebody mentioned was laundry reimbursement. And this was somebody who hadn't gotten in trouble for it. But they said, am I going to get in trouble if I also wash my spouse's clothes? Or do I actually have to start separating our stuff? Because, technically he's not an employee. There should be like a reasonable, assessment of whether somebody's trying to be abusive to the system or they're using it in a way that's creative and beneficial.
I mean, I think the interesting thing there too is how the kind of interweaving of our work and our life, which was obviously happening for a long time before the pandemic, and then since the pandemic has happened even more so. And so it raises that question because a company can say, I only want these things to be used for work related, but then part of the reason they're giving them is because they want you to work on the time that really should be your family time. So, it raises a lot of those interesting questions.
Yeah, I mean, they're giving workers $70 a day so that they eat all of their meals at the office. Like, that's probably not good work-life balance to begin with.
No, definitely. I probably also imagine that I think this is occurring for multiple reasons. I think partly because tech workers in particular, but workers in general now don't have as much power as they had a few years ago. But I also think it's because there is this clear shift towards a more hybrid working style. I know certain companies are trying to put the, toothpaste back in the tube, but I think that ship has sailed. I'm going to mix metaphors here, but I think that it's reasonable to say that if you are giving people more flexibility, and so they're going to be spending more time at home, you should pull back perks at the office. I actually don't think that's completely unreasonable.
Is this happening because the labor market is slowing down, or is it just like we heard about it this time, but it's going on all the time? People are cracking down or like policing these kinds of benefits. I read there was the Journal had a story from like 2009. Fidelity or branch of Fidelity fired some like investment managers, I believe, because for running a fantasy football league, which seems, I mean, if everyone was fired who did fantasy football at work, we would have no workforce anymore, basically. But it was 2009. And, and the argument the reporter was making was like in downturns, there's any excuse comes before you and then you fire, you take any excuse.
My vibes-based analysis is just that companies are still pretty pissed off that workers are not coming back. And they sort of have this attitude toward it that workers are somehow abusing the system. And I think it's filtered into other aspects of office and work life. A lot of the pieces that we read in the prep to talk about this were coming, granted, from places like the Journal, where they tend to be more management friendly than labor friendly. But the framing was always, companies are getting tired of employees, scrolling their phones during meetings and using the office copier to copy things for their kids, whatever. And they sort of framed it as stealing from the company. And, on the same basis, you could argue that having to do a lot of stuff at home for work or do it, outside of normal office hours is stealing from labor. So but the vibe seems to be very pro company in a lot of the stuff we're reading.
That's so true. Stealing from labor is never a big deal. In fact, it's like, if you're not stealing from labor, what are you even doing? Like, if your workers aren't checking their phones, 24/7, do they even care about their jobs? Are they even quote unquote engaged at work? The obsession with worker engagement. There's so much less talk about employers abusing the perks that we provide for them. Now I feel angry. Also, here's a question. So I did math, and $70 a day for, a full-time worker working 5 days a week and taking 2 weeks vacation, that comes out to $17,500 a year. Elizabeth, Anna, would you rather just have an extra $17,500 a year in your paycheck, or do you want these Uber Eats credit? credits.
70K, obviously. And, the companies can write these things off, so they have an incentive to do it this way. But
Well, I want the credits because I'm not taxed on that.
Oh.
Just
I think if you have, so if you're above a certain amount of income, I think that's a rational decision. But for a lot of people where cash is important, I think they would take the cash.
No, I mean, I think it's reasonable as you're, no, 100%. Like if your, marginal tax rate is rising, then it makes much more sense to get things where you're not being taxed on them. If it's less, then it makes more sense to get the cash.
Well, I mean, if you're making $40,000 a year, you want the $17,000 extra. But these big tech workers are making like $200,000, $300,000 a year.
You're probably not getting $17,000 if you're only making $40,000 a year.
Well, I also think there's a lot of, with the corporations, when they talk about these abuses, I think the big one is for these companies that provide meals in-house, like Google, and they have these, fine dining experts who come in and create these incredible food bars. They started banning people from bringing Tupperware to the company because they would take food home. And I understand worrying that some people might abuse that, but outside of an extreme scenario where someone comes and just empties the whole bar and takes it home, I think this is, nitpicking things at the margins that really demoralize people whenever you start policing them aggressively.
We had free lunch when I was at HuffPost that we had like different restaurants would come in and have booths set up, and you could get like, it was truly amazing. And people would bring a Tupperware. They would get one lunch to eat in the office and then get a second lunch to take home. And I remember people grousing about it, but it was like, who cares?
Also, I would do that. It's like you get home very late and you're fucking tired. You don't want to cook.
Yeah.
Also, there's always so much wasted food from corporate events. It's not like people are eating all the food. There's always a ton of food left over.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Felix interviewed Carrie Sun about her recent book, which was about her time working at a private equity firm. And the descriptions of food in that book are astonishing. She would describe these lunches where they would bring in sushi from Nobu, elaborate desserts, cupcakes from somewhere fancy, cakes, all of it. No one would touch anything, and then they would throw it all away, just like in Succession, just like when they throw out the lobsters because the guy wants pizza.
I think just give people money generally, though, because one of the things that, at least during pre-COVID, when people were still in the office all the time, I've worked with so many startups that offer benefits that really are sort of mushy wellness benefits that, first of all, people don't have time to take advantage of or whatever. But there's a kind of paternalism to it that says, workers can't make their own decisions about what will keep them healthy. And sometimes it's just infantilizing. I am not a fan of enforced fun at work. So, sort of corporate retreats that are entirely about wellness or, work. I worked with a company that where people did 2 and 3 minute meditations before meetings. And, the sort of, I guess, hippie-ish side of the company loved this. And then everyone working in editorial hated it. And it was the same idea. It was like, well, this makes everyone happier and healthier. And it's like, well, it probably makes everyone a little healthier, but it definitely demoralizes.
It's not healthy. Company. Eating all 3 meals of the day at your desk at work from takeout places.
100%. Yeah.
The cafeteria today has replaced the refectory of old. Modern man has created new words for his new way of living and thinking.
So before we get to the numbers round, I want to tell you about today's Slate Plus bonus mini episode available in your podcast feed. We're talking about covering the parents of convicted criminals, actually, and why that might be more complicated than it first sounds. And should we even care about the parents of convicted criminals if they're adults? That's all in the Slate Plus bonus mini episode. It's really good, so I recommend that you listen to it. Slate Plus members can get access to that in their feeds right now. If you're not a Slate Plus member and you don't want to hear ads and you want other great Slate stuff, you should sign up for Slate Plus, because with Slate Plus, you get ad-free listening on all Slate podcasts and unlimited access to all Slate.com content. There's a members-only newsletter and, of course, an exclusive bonus segment in every regular Slate Money episode and in a lot of other Slate podcasts as well. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking try free at the top of our show page or slate.com/moneyplus. That's slate.com/moneyplus. This episode is brought to you by public.com. Did you know you can lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com? The Federal Reserve recently announced a big rate cut, and there could be more rate cuts this year and in 2025 as well. That's good news if you're looking to buy a home, but it might not be so good for the interest you earn on your cash. So, if you want to lock in a 6% or higher yield with a diversified portfolio of high yield and investment grade bonds, check out public.com. It only takes a couple of minutes to sign up, and once you lock in your yield, you can earn regular interest payments even as rates decline. Lock in a 6% or higher yield with a bond account at public.com/slate money. But remember, your yield is not locked in until you invest. Brought to you by Public Investing, member FINRA and SIPC. As of September 26, 2024, the average annualized yield to worst across the bond account is greater than 6%. Yield to worst is not guaranteed. Not an investment recommendation. All investing involves risk. Visit public.com/disclosures/bond-account for more info. All right. Should we do numbers? Elizabeth, what do you got?
Okay, my number is 70, and that's decibels. And so I've been thinking about our leaf blower conversations. And the Wirecutter recommended a leaf blower that is around 70 decibels, and it's electric and it's cordless. And it works a little bit differently than a gas engine leaf blower. So it sort of like blows leaves in little bursts. But that made me sort of look up. It's like, well, what does a normal leaf blower sound like? And I found a study that basically said, if you're holding the leaf blower, the sort of averages are somewhere around 106 decibels. So that is a pretty significant difference. If you must have a leaf blower, it seems like the electric ones are better. And 70 decibels is about the equivalent of a Dyson hairdryer. 65 decibels is your Nespresso when it's cleaning itself. So
Nespressos clean themselves?
They do.
I got to get one of those.
They're great.
Also, what is up with Dyson hair dryers? Are they supposed to be like better than regular hair dryers? Have you guys used them? That's a different conversation, but I need to know. You don't know?
They're supposed to be better. They're insanely expensive.
So expensive.
But I guess I just don't care about my hair that much.
It just seems like way
too
too much
money. If it could dry my hair faster, I would be interested in that.
If it could actually make my hair look like what it looks like after I come out of the salon, I would pay for that. But I don't.
Yeah, I would pay a lot for that.
Yeah, we all have long hair. We're the target market for it. But I don't know. I'm too old. I don't care.
All right. Anna?
My number is 19.4, and that's days. This is actually somewhat related to our last topic. So it appears that the sick man of Europe is actually sick. So the average number of days that German workers are taking off has increased pretty significantly since before the pandemic. This has been seen in other places, but it seems to be particularly notable in Germany. And also, I think apparently it's particularly a conversation in Germany. I guess, because I'll mention Elon Musk here, Tesla, I guess, in Germany was actually sending people to unexpected visits at people's houses who'd said they were sick just to make sure they were like actually sick. Just crazy. And there was actually a study that came out.
That's crazy.
That's the worst example of corporate policing.
For real. Like
Elon Musk at your door, like, can I take your temperature?
I was like thinking of like Ferris Bueller, where you like run and
really are sick. Can you imagine like vomiting on the person doing that?
Right, you put your hand on the lamp to get the palms sweaty.
Exactly.
So why do we think this is happening in Germany though?
Well, they said partly it's because they actually did change a law to make it easier to get a doctor's note, which to me raised the question of, you need a doctor's note? Like, what are you in 8th grade? But apparently that seems to be part of it. I think the other reason people are talking about it is because Germany's economy is really struggling. And there actually was a study that tried to suggest that, like, well, if people hadn't taken all these sick days, now, of course, that's ridiculous because Germany's economy is struggling because their biggest customer, China, is struggling and they no longer have access to cheap oil and gas from Russia. That's why they're struggling. It's not the sick workers. But it is interesting that that's what people are looking at.
People are so quick to blame.
Oh, you have to blame the workers.
So quick to blame the workers. Come on. Okay. My number is 800 million. That is the sales of Nerds gummy clusters in 2024. So I don't know if people are aware of Nerds gummy clusters, but they are this incredible candy. They're a gummy, but they're surrounded, they're little chunks with crunchy little nerds. So it's like this great textural experience. And they're really good. My family really likes them. 6 years ago, before the invention of Nerds gummy clusters, their sales were less than $50 million. So, I mean, that's like 1,500% increase or something. I don't know. I'm talking about Nerds gummy clusters because it was just Halloween. We didn't really talk about it last week. Apologies to everyone. Nerds gummy clusters are so hot right now that an article about them appeared in both the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times 5 days apart last week. Basically the same story of like the creation of the Nerds gummy clusters and like why they have done so well and like how Kylie Jenner like helped make them really popular and why people really love them. And, you know, people talking about them on Reddit saying like, my wife left me because I ate too many Nerds gummy clusters. I don't think that's actually true, but it's worth repeating.
That may not have been why.
I don't
It was
think
a symptom
that was
of a
the
larger
reason.
problem. Yeah.
I don't know. Probably something else going on there. Yeah. But so, you know, if you don't know about these, they're very popular and I recommend them.
Have you had one?
Oh yes, Elizabeth. I've partaken.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where do you rate them as a candy?
I would rate them as candy. Like if you're accepting chocolate, like if chocolate isn't included in the scale and is 10 the best and 1 the worst.
Yes.
I would rate Nerds gummy clusters as a 9 candy. Yeah.
Wow.
They might be better than gummy bears if people like gummy bears, which are also gummy. Anything right now is very, very popular with candy eaters. I don't know if you guys include yourselves.
My kid ranked all of his Halloween candy last night and put them in piles from 1 to 10. So this is why.
What's his top candy?
His top was Skittles. And he said because it's consistently good.
That's true.
I'm trying to remember what the bottom was Tootsie Rolls, I think.
Yeah, I get that.
I was just going to say that like when I was a little kid, I really enjoyed organizing all of my candy. I usually did not eat a tremendous amount of my candy because I like chocolate, but I don't actually like candy. But I enjoyed organizing it.
And on that note, that's it for our show today. If you have thoughts or comments, candy recommendations, send them to slatemoney@slate.com. If you're a Slate Plus member, you should go and find the Slate Plus super special bonus segment where we're going to talk about the parents of young adults that are in prison, such as Sam Bankman-Fried, and their plight and why the New York Times cares so much about it. That's for Slate Plus members. Thanks to Cheyna Roth and Jared Downing for producing. I'm Emily Peck, and on behalf of Anna Szymanski and Elizabeth Spires, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you back here next week on Slate Money.